everyone. A very good evening to one and all present here. The entire team of today's webinar welcomes you to this quite an interesting webinar session. My special thanks to all the three panelists for taking out time from their busy clinical practice and being, agreeing to be a part of it. We all know that COVID-19 has led to a dramatic loss in human life worldwide and presents an unprecedented challenge to the healthcare system. It has not only affected public financially, but also emotionally. Many people have lost their near and dear ones. So I would just like to take an opportunity to acknowledge their pain, their grief, and their loss. Even before the second wave could be controlled in India, there arises yet another challenge for the medical professionals with the rising case of mucormycosis. Quoting yesterday's news, Maharashtra has recorded over 1,500 cases with 90 fatalities from this fungal infection and all over COVID survivors. Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Orissa, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Union Territories of Chandigarh have declared mucormycosis as an epidemic, making it a notable disease under the Epidemic Disease Act. Hence, as healthcare professionals, it becomes really important for us to discuss this topic and act in time. So before we move ahead, let me quickly give you all a brief that why is this webinar different from the others that we are having of mucormycosis or others which we are having lately. There are three elements which make it unique. The first one, it's a multidisciplinary approach. It's a group of team of doctors who are specialized, who are basically, dealing with mucormycosis day in and day out. We have an infectious disease specialist, Dr. Rajesh Vinyala. We have an ENT, Dr. Rahul Modi, and an oculoplastic surgeon. Second, we have, like I said, three talented specialists, basically clinicians who are dealing with COVID and mucormycosis. And, so we have some takeaway practical tips from here to go. And the third, it's not a didactic lecture, but it's more like a discussion where I would be glad if, all of y'all can participate. Feel free to ask all your questions. You can, put your questions or your doubts in the chat box and, we'll surely try to solve them all. So I would just like to, before we move ahead, I'm just going to share my screen. So till the time I'm just arranging, I just would want to start the entire program with Dr. Rajesh Vinyala sir's, good wishes. Let me introduce Dr. Rajesh Vinyala sir is a physician working at, co-founder of Sanjeevani Hospital, Malad East. He has worked relentlessly during the COVID times. Just quote me if I correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Vinyala sir, that he's seen or treated or rather saved more than 5,000 lives during this entire COVID pandemic and treated more than 10,000 of patients in OPD basis. So what is your take over this? I'm sure all over the world, physicians are, in a very difficult situation. They have actually tried to save someone's life from COVID and now they are, getting maybe mucormycosis and, it's leading to death. So what is your take on this, sir? I'm just going to share.
First and foremost, my regards to all the senior people there. I can see Dr. Shyam Agarwal, our mentor, and who's been behind all this COVID war which we've been taking up at Sanjeevani Hospital. So my regards to Dr. Shyam Agarwal and other senior members who have joined us for the discussion. Now, it has been quite a journey for last 1 year seeing COVID patients. Initially, we were surprised, how so much of infections coming in. Somehow, over the last 6 to 8 months, we could, get a hang of treating COVID, and now we are seeing this problem of mucormycosis. So it has been a real challenge all this time, walking from one step to the other. We could get some grasp on COVID, and now this problem of mucormycosis have come up, where we definitely think complete team effort is what is required. And COVID still, a good chest physician, a good infectious disease specialist could manage. But now with this epidemic of mucormycosis coming in, we need a complete team of a good ophthalmologist, a good ENT consultant, and people around you to get it easily diagnosed and help the patient. Because otherwise, it's like for COVID, we did not have any treatment plan on us. We were discovering treatment one after the other, and we were using them with our experience on patients. But the mucormycosis is something where we have a treatment, and if I think we can diagnose it early and help the patient, then it's a really salvageable condition. Otherwise, it carries a very high mortality if not diagnosed in time. So I think definitely we all must, take it up as a challenge and work as a good team so that we can help so many patients who are coming up with mucormycosis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your kind words. So before we start, and I hand over the platform to Dr. Rahul Modi to start to take the discussion further. Let me, it's a proud privilege for me to introduce all the three panelists here. So first we have Dr. Rajesh Binyala, sir, who's a senior most. He's a practicing physician, a cardiologist, diabetologist, and infectious disease specialist. He's a co-founder and chief consulting physician at Sanjeevani Hospital, Malad East, which is a 120-bedded hospital. And since last more than a year, it is converted completely into a COVID hospital. He has an experience of more than 26 years in this field. And like I say, in true, he's a COVID warrior. He has, worked, like I said earlier, he worked relentlessly during this COVID pandemic to serve the society and give the COVID patient something what we called as a second life. Thank you so much for having, for being here, being a part of this. Second comes Dr. Rahul Modi. So I call him Bhaiya because I have known him since many years now. Dr. Modi is MS in ENT and DNB, the co-founder of Clinic situated at Malad East in Mumbai. He has completed his fellowship in thyroid and parathyroid surgery from Harvard University of USA. He's a visiting faculty in the Division of Sleep Surgery, Stanford University, and a consultant at Hiranandani Hospital and Nanavati Hospital. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation, Dr. Rahul, and being a part of this multidisciplinary team. Third, many of you all are ophthalmologists here. She needs no introduction. Dr. Prerna Tehliani is a very well-known oculoplastic surgeon in Mumbai. She is a trained fellowship in ophthalmic plastic surgery, surgeon and ocular oncologist, and a co-founder of an exclusive ophthalmic suit, Mumbai Eye Plastic Surgery. After completing her residency from Shankradeva Nethralaya, she pursued a 2 years fellowship at LV Prasad, Hyderabad. Her skill in the subject were further consolidated at Jules Eye Hospital under Professor Francis in UCLA. She has 13 peer-reviewed publications, 3 book chapters, and has edited a book on advances in oculoplasty. Dr. Tehliani loves teaching residents, and she's happiest at work. And I love this line. When I'm not at work, she's seen traveling in forest of India, spending time with her son. Thank you so much, Dr. Prerna, for accepting the invitation and being here. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over the platform to Dr. Rahul Modi to start the panel discussion and take this webinar ahead. Thank you. Over to you.
Right. Thank you, Aarti. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Aarti for taking the initiative. It's a pleasure to see all the respected seniors here, Dr. Binyala, Shyam sir, and to see a lot of friends. I've been lucky to be associated with wonderful ophthalmologists all throughout my early years and even now. So, it's a good platform to connect with all of you. So let me just start the scare.
So Dr. Rahul, we are overwhelmed. We have more than 90 plus. We have 98 participants already. 99. Oh my God, the count is just going on. So,
so that's great, right? I mean, that shows the interest that, and I hope my screen is sharing now, right?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So I'll just go on the slideshow mode. Right. So rhino-orbital cerebral mucormycosis, right? That's the topic of the day. And this is the reason why, it's a hot topic, because you open any news channel, like the update on the COVID numbers, you're getting updates on the black fungus numbers nowadays. So it's a real scare and it's a bad disease. And I think the attention is, rightly reserved. And what do we know about mucormycosis? We know it's an old illness. It's a rare, what used to be a rare form of a fulminant invasive fungal sinusitis, classically affecting immunocompromised patients, those with diabetes, HIV, transplant recipients, chronic steroid therapy. But even during my residency days, I've seen, I would say about 20 to 30% of our patients would have no identifiable immunocompromise. And these used to be the most challenging to treat. We would operate them, give them boatloads of amphotericin, but within a couple of months of stopping the amphotericin, they would come back. We know that the disease has a rapid spread within days, and as per the CDC data, we have 54% mortality. So that's a pretty high, a numbing number when I compare that, say, with like a 2% mortality for COVID, which has created so much of a scare and a worry in the entire country. So mucormycosis is not an easy, although we know it's been there for some time, it's not an easy disease to manage, especially in sick patients. So why now? So so we know that fungal sinusitis essentially happens depending upon the host defense mechanism to the fungal form. So the same fungus in an immunocompetent patient may cause nothing or just a saprophytic infection. If the person is allergic or atopic to it, the fungus would lead to an AFRS. AFRS is an allergic fungal rhinosinusitis. However, we have seen in patients who have long-standing allergies, when they become diabetic, the same allergic fungi becomes an invasive fungi. So this is a combination that we are seeing in our COVID patients. They already have low immunity for a lot of reasons. They are recovering from a severe illness. They have been given steroids, in some cases very high dose steroids. A lot of them are diabetics, or even the non-diabetics, they become diabetic because of the steroid intake, uncontrolled sugars, and that forms a very convenient combination to develop mucor. So, I mean, I would like to take at this point Dr. Binyala's view. What do you think, sir, is the problem here? Do you think, apart from steroids, is there like a particular factor that the COVID virus you think is initiating or suppressing, like a T cell immunity in that sense, which is perhaps causing this?
So thank you, Rahul. Here, definitely, I mean, as we all know, that mucormycosis is usually an infection of the immunocompromised patient. The two reasons why COVID has been a causative reason for such an increase in numbers. One is COVID definitely interferes with your immune system. The immune system is busy fighting the virus, and your immune system is down, and there's a reason the mucor gets a chance to grow. The second very reason is the COVID infection per se can initiate diabetes in a patient who is not even a diabetic in the past, because COVID is known to cause endocrine storm, just like how your immunity storm, cytokine storm happening in your body. Similarly, an endocrine storm also happens with COVID, where the pancreatic beta cells get affected and they stop making insulin and your sugars start going up. So we have seen quite a number of patients who have no family history, no past history of diabetes, still presenting with sugars of more than 400 plus. Then on this, the only proven treatment till now for COVID is the steroids, which have been used worldwide. So every patient, irrespective of the grade of COVID which he comes with, we initiate them with steroids. So that again pushes the sugars to sky levels. So these are the patients who have very high sugars, and especially if you're a diabetic, their sugars go more than 400 to 500. They already have a compromised immune system because the COVID virus is causing havoc in the immunity. And of course, thirdly, the COVID infection per se has already invaded the sinus mucosa, because of which it becomes easier for the mucor to establish contact with the mucosa and create an infection. Because already the base is done by the COVID infection, which starts from the sinus mucosa. Otherwise, our secretions are strong enough to push the mucor down into the throat, and it's thrown out to the digestive system.
Right.
But because of this change in the sugar levels, especially if you are associated with diabetic ketoacidosis, it really predisposes for the mucor to invade the vessels and cause a necrosis, tissue necrosis, and invade the local area. So COVID definitely is the most important causative factor for mucor right now, because it affects from all 3 points of view. The immunity goes down, the sugars go up, and the treatment itself makes even a normal healthy person immunocompromised because he's on steroids. Plus, in certain critical patients, we are using immunosuppressive drugs like the IL-6 inhibitors, tocilizumab. These drugs have a very strong toll on your immune system. So COVID is the most important reason right now we're seeing this.
Right. Dr. Prerna, your thoughts on, there is a lot of, this talk about oxygen cylinders being the root cause of all worries. And that is why patients are getting it. And, there was this thought of people not washing their masks enough. And the mask is causing, anything else that you think? Because a lot of people are even, I saw a tweet today by a rheumatologist who is saying that I've used steroids all my life and I've never seen any mucor develop in my patient. So, any thoughts on the oxygen cylinders? Because I strongly feel it's the combination of steroid, diabetes, and the reduced immunity from.
Yes.
I'm not a big fan of the oxygen theory, but
Correct. So, am I audible?
yes.
Yes.
So I agree with you, Dr. Rahul, because as we all know, mucor is a ubiquitous fungus, and it's we are exposed to it on a daily basis. So it's a combination of factors, like you already mentioned, where people who are more at risk are the ones with uncontrolled sugars, either diabetics or newly diagnosed diabetics, and the COVID itself reducing the innate immunity in the respiratory passages initially. So I think it's a couple of these factors. Unfortunately, I think media is propagating a lot of myths as well. That's why we have organized this meeting here on this forum. So I also don't agree with the oxygen cylinders and the unclean masks to be a contributing factor.
Right. And most of these patients are presenting, say 20 days to a month later from the discharge to the hospital. And I'm not so sure whether the disease has such a large incubation period, even if the person has received a lot of oxygen from the hospitals. Okay, so moving forward, predisposing factors, we talked about steroids. Sir, just a quick word, Dr. Binyala, on what dosages do we recommend? When do you think we should start?
Yes, so now the latest recommendation for COVID treatment is steroids should be used in lower doses only, and not more than 10 days of initial therapy. So we start with say maximum 6 milligram of dexamethasone for a day, or not more than 80 milligram of methylprednisolone, which is equal to around 50 milligram of hydrocortisone. So this is the maximum which you give for the first 5 to 7 days in intensive phase. And once the patient's phase is controlled, then you go down and taper it off and finish it off by 10 days to 14 days, not more than that. So long-term steroid therapy is not advised. Short and low-dose steroid therapy is what is advised for COVID patients as of now.
Great. So
and definitely you have to prescribe. It's not that with the fear of mucor you can stop steroid. Steroid is the mainstay of treatment for COVID.
Yes.
It has been proven, so we have to use it. And we have to use it very judiciously.
So anybody receiving boatloads of steroid, and I've seen patients receiving 1 gram of methylprednisolone twice a day for 3 days, that is a pulse dose therapy, we should have our antennas on the high. We know we have talked about pure glycemic control, we have talked about neutropenia. Oxygen is someone is puppeting. What do you think the use of voriconazole, sir? That is also being proposed, I would say, as a cause for mucormycosis. That is because, does it suppress the normal flora and allows mucor to grow? What do you think is the reason for voriconazole to be used?
So is this question directed to me, Rahul?
Yes, sir. To you.
So voriconazole should not be used unless.
Sir, you are on mute, Doctor.
Definitely not. And as such, voriconazole has no role in mucormycosis. So if you use voriconazole, as you rightly said, that it may suppress your local immunity, and it can give mucor a chance to go up.
So voriconazole as a predisposing factor, sir. Some hospitals are using
just as a preventive measure. I don't think so you should use it unless you have a proven fungal growth. You should not use voriconazole.
Right.
And you usually don't see fungal infection in the initial 8 to 10 days. It's only after the first 8 to 10 days of COVID therapy that you will find patients, because of being on steroids for 10, 12 days, and because of the COVID damage to the body, become so weak that the secondary fungal infection come up. So initiation of voriconazole should not be done in first.
And broad spectrum antibiotics, how much do you think is responsible for altering the flora and causing mucor? Are you able to hear me, sir?
Hello?
Yes, sir. So broad spectrum antibiotics as a cause for the reason I'm stressing on all these points is because it's very important when a patient comes post-COVID to raise our antennas, especially the patient has received, lots of medications during their COVID stay. And that helps us in kind of triaging a patient into, ordering an expensive investigation such as an MRI for minor symptoms, for minor cold symptoms. So, I mean, I take this history, and if the patient has received more medications, then I have a very low threshold for ordering investigations, really. Okay, so a little bit about the organisms. Rhizopus species, which is the most common cause and known to cause about 70% of the rhinocerebral mucormycosis cases. There are other less frequent species, the rhizomucor, the Absidia, the Cunningella, there is Saxoniaceae. But essentially, I mean, the diagnosis for us clinicians in terms of it's made upon the fungal smear. And on fungal smear, they look for aseptate hyphae. The identification of the species is really little late in the course of the treatment, and more so to decide alternative therapies if the first line therapy is not working. Now, going to the pathogenesis in a bit, just to kind of recap and highlight why the raised blood sugars are a problem. The raised blood sugar leads to acidosis. Acidosis leads to increased free iron. That is why the thought process that does ferritin level correlate with mucormycosis or not, I don't think there's a lot of data to suggest that. But free iron, as soon as the acidemia increases, free iron in the blood increases, which acts the substrate for the mucor to grow and proliferate. And that's when the mucor invades from the tissue into the blood vessels. And once it invades into the blood vessels, that's how it disseminates. Okay, it's an angioinvasive disease. Now, coming to the evaluation of a suspected patient. So the clinical presentation, this is actually a patient which is actually related to one of my friends. And it was just in a casual conversation. He sent me this pic over WhatsApp of his aunt, saying that, she's feeling some kind of a nose block, there is some swelling around. Do you think this is worrisome? And this was not when we were in the midst of a black fungus pandemic. This was about a few months back. So the common symptoms that we see, it will be very, very non-specific. Patients will have very low grade symptoms. Typically, they would not be very severe symptoms of sinusitis, some maxillary toothache, eye symptoms. I mean, Dr. Prerna can tell us, and sometimes patients may present with a stroke and altered sensorium. Dr. Prerna, anything specific, for our ophthal colleagues here, if you may suggest as a key sign to look for?
So a couple of features are there which we are seeing in these patients with mucormycosis. Definitely the more extreme cases are presenting with total ophthalmoplegia or just plain external or internal ophthalmoplegia. But I have a couple of cases I can show where patients are presenting with just a little bit of eyelid swelling and very mild ptosis. But based on history and clinical examination, you have to have a high risk of index to send them across to your ENT colleague for diagnostic endoscopy and to confirm the diagnosis. So there are a couple of symptoms I have highlighted. Maybe if I can just share my screen, I can show that slide. Sure. And there's also a probable mechanism why these symptoms appear. Okay. So yeah, so like I mentioned, you can have plain eyelid edema or you can have ptosis. You can have just limitation of ocular motility, what we commonly call as restricted extraocular muscles. Even a pupillary dilatation, diminution of vision. So sometimes there are ophthalmologists who are getting a call to just look at the fundus to rule out CRAO. But the adnexa and the muscles and the eyelids are something that have to be taken a look at. There could be very mild or gross proptosis, plain chemosis of the conjunctiva. Another point I want to reiterate is while you are observing or evaluating the patient every day, it's also important to look at the other eye. We'll talk about this later. And there can also be lag ophthalmos. Now, most of the eye symptoms I suggest happen either, like Dr. Rahul mentioned, because of direct ischemia, since it's an angioinvasive fungus, or because we all know orbit is a very tight compartment. So there could be a compartment syndrome at the orbital apex, which can cause any of these symptoms because of paralysis of the nerves.
Right. And do you think, like, like we see in the regular orbital cellulitis, which occurs in kids secondary to, complicated sinusitis, things may follow a set pattern. Do you see that happening in Mucor? Like, there would be eyelid swelling earlier, then a frozen globe, then a vision loss, or, I mean, wanted to know your inputs. You know
Yeah.
where I'm heading to, right?
Correct, yeah. So we are not seeing any set pattern, though commonly what we see is a medial orbital involvement or an apical involvement. But I remember seeing one patient who presented with a more or less quiet eye and had only orbital apical involvement, which had happened because I think a debridement was done, but there was some remnant in the pterygopalatine or the retromaxillary space, and that had gone up to the apex and the cavernous sinus. So most commonly what I still see is ptosis followed by external ophthalmoplegia and then vision loss. This is what I have seen commonly in my experience. Sometimes there has been extension of the mucor from the temporalis and the infratemporal more into the lateral orbit and less into the medial orbit after a debridement.
Right. And just to add, mucor does not follow a set pattern because it's an angioinvasive spread. It's an angioembolic spread. So you may have a person with, completely fair movements and she'll just have vision loss. Very little or no orbital involvement, real orbital involvement, and you would feel that her vision will be all right. You'll end up having a lady with a complete vision loss. So again, medico-legally very important to document all of this at the first visit itself. So I'll just go back to, please.
Sorry, at that point, this is an excellent point you've brought about because a couple of colleagues are aggressively excentrating a lot of orbits. And sometimes when there is no gross orbital involvement, like you said, it's an angioinvasive disease. So sometimes the vision loss is only ischemic and there is no sign of orbital disease. Right. So at this point, I have seen excentrations being done, but somehow my threshold for excentrating is not so low. So we still observe, we can keep like a non-seeing eye with the orbit intact. So this is an excellent point you've brought out.
Right. Great. Vinyala sir, my question to you, do you commonly see altered sensorium in your patients that you have seen? Because again, the challenge that we face is we had a patient with stroke and we were not sure whether the stroke is a post-COVID stroke or a mucormycosis related stroke. And how much aggressive one needs to be in terms of providing anticoagulation and other things. So your input, sir, for the altered sensorium or neurological events.
Neurological events with mucormycosis, if there is a
Dr. Rajesh Vinyala sir, we cannot hear you.
Am I audible now?
So your voice is very shallow.
Can you hear me now?
No, sir.
Volume is very low.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Nice to know that.
Hello? I'm sorry, I don't know something.
So meanwhile,
should we move ahead and then we can come back to sir for the, sir, we are not able to hear you, sir.
I'll just see what's happening. Hello? Just continue, I'll find out there's some problem here.
Dr. Rahul, sir, we have a question from the audience. It's like, I have seen one rhino-orbital mucormycosis patient with no history of COVID, no admission to the hospital. So kindly enlighten the role of, so this I think would be directed to Prerna, retrobulbar injection of amphotericin B. Prerna, we can't hear you. You will have to unmute yourself.
So yeah, I was going to come to that in the cases that I was going to show. I'm not a very strong believer of the transcutaneous retrobulbar amphotericin B that we often speak about. Primarily, it's an off-label use. It's not science. No one knows the exact concentration that has to be used, how much is the uptake, and what is the effect. What I do know is it causes a lot of orbital inflammation, and it can cause compartment syndrome per se. But for whatever it is worth, in cases which have segmental or sectoral involvement, where you don't have diffuse orbital involvement and it's just in one particular corner, I have still used it in the dose of 2.5 to 3.5 milligrams per ml. But along with that, I've always done a lateral canthotomy and inferior cantholysis just to relieve the pressure of the eyelid onto the orbit. The other way of decompressing the orbit is I leave it up to the ENT surgeons who are very, very proficient with skull base and the medial wall decompression endoscopically. So TRAMB is definitely, it's a controversial topic.
Right.
Right.
Hello?
Yes, so now we can hear you, Dr. Rajesh.
Yeah, I can hear. Very sorry for that small. Now, see, now neurological manifestations which we see with COVID are usually, of course, as Rahul mentioned, it's an embolic phenomenon where we can get infarcts in the frontal lobe and temporal lobe areas where the usual presentation is abnormal behavioral changes only in the patient. So many times we've seen patients just coming with irrelevant behavior, irrelevant talks, and with subsequent screening with MRI, we find that he's got a stroke in the brain. But then to differentiate whether it's a COVID-related stroke or whether it's mucormycosis, usually we have a, when the MRI imaging is done, we can see the invasive nature of the mucormycosis in the sinuses also. So the stroke per se without any sinus involvement, I would consider more with a COVID-related stroke. And if we have associated sinus involvement, then definitely it is mucor-related.
Sure.
So accordingly, we take a call when we treat this patient who comes with an neurological manifestation. So when we're doing, in fact, the first 6 months, we never bother about mucor. But now, since we are sending them for a scan, we always ask for the sinuses also to be screened so we can pick up any involvement.
Yes.
So
Yes.
usually the cerebral stroke with a sinus shadow, definitely think about mucor.
Yes. And I mean, just to tell, I was speaking to my neurology colleagues also across the state. They are seeing a lot of calls they are getting for altered sensorium, and sometimes the presentation of mucor is with altered sensorium, and the symptoms,
yes.
the other symptoms may not be there. So it's a tricky disease, and it's not so uncommon, and it necessarily may not be very late in the disease that the patient may have altered sensorium. So just to highlight that point. So the first thing that we would do apart from the general ENT examination, something that is very useful. Now I'm keeping a very low threshold to do this. It's an OPD procedure, is a nasal endoscopy. It's a very simple procedure done. This is a patient with frank mucor, so this is not so difficult to diagnose. Perhaps a good headlight examination will also tell us, but the idea being you will see changes like this in the nasal mucosa, not very difficult to pick up. And typically what we'll do if we are in a clinic setting, we will just take a little bit of a swab from this black tissue and send it to our friendly microbiologist just to do a simple KOH smear and just to prove that it's mucor, typically before taking up the patient for a radical surgery. It's good to have that confirmation medico-legally. However, even if we are able to see some minor changes, and a lot of these patients may have some very early changes, then it does help us in prognosticating the patient in terms of which patient goes for imaging and in which patient we wait. Now, once we have suspected symptoms, we have done an ENT endoscopic evaluation. We have seen a black necrotic eschar or on the nasal mucosa, or the patient has presented with neurological or eye issues. The first investigation should be an MRI of the PNS with contrast and not a CT scan. Although MRI is a big kill, the cost part, the emotional part, and everything is there, but the pickup rate I feel is far more, especially in early diseases where there is little or no bony erosion. So this is a case in point that we had this patient with ours, and the CT scan would not have picked up the early changes, because remember, this is an angio spread. For the disease to spread from the ethmoids into the orbit, they don't need to eat up the lamina, which is what, say, an ethmoidal malignancy would do. Here, the lamina may still be intact and there may be non-specific changes on the CT scan. MRI is very good in picking up. You see this T2 waves. So the bright part is essentially the active part, but if you see the part which is dark and you see this necrotic tissues in these images, which guides us. And again, MRI, I think, is the investigation of choice for most orbital pathologies also. So we are able to get more info from the orbit. Any particular thing, Dr. Prerna, that you would like to look in the MRI when you are evaluating the MRI of patient?
So yeah,
Any key points that you would like to add to this?
yeah.
I'll have to leave.
So, okay. Yeah, so this is a good description that you've given. We basically look out for necrotic areas, which are the less attenuated areas on a MRI scan. I also prefer MRI with contrast. What I still do look at in very gross disease, what happens is sometimes in spite of the small vessel angioinvasion through the ethmoids, and you don't need the medial wall to be disrupted. What I specifically look at in the orbit is the location of the orbital involvement, whether it is more posteromedially in the apex, whether it is gross, whether it is retrobulbar along the optic nerve, because those are the features or the morphological characteristics which help us to determine the role of debridement in the form of exenteration, whether it is a yes or a no. The other thing in MR, I think that can be very tricky, is the post-debridement MRs. Earlier, we were seeing a lot of them, but luckily people are restraining themselves to doing very early imaging after debridement of the sinuses. So those can confuse the post-op edema with mucor. But these are some of the features that I look at on MRI: the amount of proptosis, the area of involvement because of mucor, whether there are, so sometimes I have received comments like the muscles are mildly enlarged. So this can happen in a compartment syndrome. That does not mean that there is direct involvement of the muscles. This can happen because of backflow of the venous blood and congestive changes in the muscle. So you have to really study the images because unless like you have endoscopy for us looking at anything behind the eye, we have to rely heavily on imaging.
Sure.
Yeah.
And any that you use MRI say for follow-ups in patients with say an intact vision? What frequency and what would be like your protocol? I know I'm asking this question a little ahead, but since the imaging is up, I thought I'll bring that point.
Yeah.
You got my question, right?
Again, yeah, this is a very relevant point. So the patients who are admitted under me and who have even undergone ENT debridement, I make it a point to assess their vision, motility, proptosis, pupils every day without fail. So ward vision is gross and it's on comparison of both the eyes. You cannot actually chart it. But this is something that has to be done every day because the spread of the disease can be very acute. It can happen over 1 or 2 days. I prefer not repeating an imaging at least within the first 7 to 10 days after debridement, unless clinically warranted, if there is clinical deterioration, because like I said, it will show a lot of post-op edema, and you have to rely slightly more heavily on what the ENT specialist on your team is seeing on endoscopy, or you have to trust how much they have debrided, because sometimes mucor and post-op edema can be very confusing.
Sure. And okay. And this is, yes, sir.
Rahul, this actually question goes to all the 3 panelists. So basically, if we have, so we know that these patients may be, their kidneys must be affected. Serum creat may be, very high for some patients where, MRI with contrast is contraindicated. So in such case, can CT be done? Like, is there any way we can exit MRI with contrast? Because, that is one of the concerns, especially in such debilitated patients.
Prerna, you want to take that?
Sorry, I didn't get the whole question. There is a contraindication to MRI, which can probably happen because of a various amount of reasons. I think claustrophobia is something that I've commonly seen in a couple of my patients. It may sound very trivial, but it is a real thing. I would prefer MRI with contrast to look at T1, T2 plus fat suppression T1. But in some cases, CT scan can be done, because if you see in CT scan, I would still prefer having a separate bone window and a soft tissue window. So that can give us some idea along with the endoscopy for the disease progression. Having said all this, a lot of ophthalmologists who first see orbital mucormycosis order a MRI without consulting an oculoplasty surgeon. So I do have a lot of patients who come in with an initial CT scan and not a MRI, and I've sometimes not repeated an MRI in them. So I think it's possible in very few situations. MRI definitely is more sensitive and more specific.
Thank you.
To answer your question, Aarti, see, if you want to give contrast, whether you do CT or MRI, and if the creatinine issue, it is going to be an issue for both imaging.
Correct.
Even without contrast, the MRI gives far more information, not only for the orbit, but for us ENTs, we prefer a CT, but even for the intracranial portion, because you may have subtle meningeal enhancements, you may have very little, because that changes the prognosis of the patient. If there is intracranial spread, and if you have documented that on an MRI, an early intracranial spread may be very difficult to pick up on a CT. So I agree with Dr. Prerna here that I would like to push for an MRI unless and until there is some real, problem like a magnet somewhere, some implant somewhere, which is kind of like preventing it. But MRI gives me far more information than just a plain CT. And, the case in point here is, this is a patient that is who actually had a globe rupture and a history of trauma and fall. And, I was asked, patient was admitted post-COVID, and patient had these non-specific findings, and it was reported as a hemosinus. Whereas all of this which is there is actual mucor. All these signs that you see. So given the history was of trauma, the radiologists themselves got confused of thinking there's a hemosinus, and clinically it was mucor. So again, keeping a very low threshold, and when we did an MRI, we could see a lot of intracranial changes and possible early intracranial spread also in this patient. So CT is good, but MRI is far better. CT is probably like, a decent screening tool, perhaps, in a resource limited setting if you want to do, if you're not sure. But if you have a slightest suspicion, go for an MRI. Okay.
So what normally, Rahul, I would just interrupt.
Yes, sir.
What we do is that we do a CT MRI with contrast for the diagnosis, and
Right.
then the treatment part also is nephrotoxic for these patients. So we then follow up with a plain MRI just
Right.
to see the progression. So
Right, sir.
initial has to be the contrast, and
Right.
then if we have an incontinence, then we can follow with plain MRI. That's what we do here, because
Perfect.
the treatment itself, the amphotericin itself is very nephrotoxic.
Yes.
And that is a big challenge. And plus, most of these patients are diabetic. So again, diabetic nephropathy is always there in the background. So it's always a challenge treating these patients and investigating at the same time, with nephrotoxic. So plain MRI follow-ups would also give you enough information for
Yes,
follow-up on the.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. For follow-ups, MRIs, again, they have a distinct advantage over CT scan. So we have got, so moving forward, we have done the endoscopy, we have taken the smear, we have confirmed it is the aseptate hyphae that we see, or we may sometimes even see invasive fungal sinusitis. Aspergillus may present, it may not just be mucormycosis with a very similar clinical presentation. How often do you use blood tests, sir, like this galactomannan? I'm sure in the ICU setting, they are very helpful.
Yeah, in the ICU now, after the advancement of, with the COVID epidemic going on, we've been using the galactomycin levels very frequently to pick up any kind of fungal growths, So they are definitely helpful to give us some kind of information that, okay, we look for a mucor or a secondary fungal infection. Till now, we were actually, looking more for, never thought about mucor. Only in last 2 months, we started thinking about mucor. But we used to do this frequently to look in patients who are becoming septic after the initial 10, 14 days of COVID treatment, and then, not able to come out of all the supports. We used to think about this. So they do help you to get a direction.
So in fungemia patients, you will get these, these symptoms positive, but if there is limited mucor, these tests may or may not help. And because of mucor may not have a very high content in the blood. So again, clinical examination and imaging is kind of like the best fallback option. Coming to management and coming to the treatment plan. So essentially there are 3 parts to the treatment. One is the aggressive debridement of the dead tissue that we do, and we have become more conservative as time has passed. I remember my residency days where we would give a very bad facial scar, remove the entire maxilla, the palate, and everything that we could kind of like debride away. whether how much involvement is there or not. And in the endoscopic era, we are being far more conservative, and there is enough data now to support that approach, to remove dead necrotic tissue, but try to minimize functional morbidity, meaning from the ENT perspective, I'll be very averse in removing the palate. I'll be very aggressive in removing the sinus structures, doing a radical job. I think something similar that Dr. Prerna may want to add from the orbital side. So, I mean, the question is, when do we go ahead and how aggressive do we need to be when managing the orbit? Dr. Prerna.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I don't have a very low threshold for exenteration because previous studies, though they have not projected so many cases of mucormycosis, but most of them have not revealed any added value or benefit post exenteration in form of survival or in form of control of disease. But only in cases where there is a lot of infective load in the orbit, which is threatening to have an intracranial spread either through the orbital apex or the fissures into the cavernous sinus. Only in extreme cases, I will go ahead and do a debridement in form of an orbital exenteration. This can also be done slightly in a more conservative or a lid sparing way, where we maintain most of the eyelid structures so that there can be a primary closure and the patient is able to wear an orbital prosthesis after 6 weeks of exenteration. So I really have to be pushed to the wall to do an orbital exenteration, but there is no consensus in terms of guidelines in the Oculoplasty Society. So I do hear of a lot of cases that are exenterated for even mild disease load. But we have not looked at the survival rates or the benefit of that yet.
Right. So again, keeping the functional morbidity in mind, remember, friends, there is a medical way around, and that's the mainstay of the treatment actually. You know, amphotericin therapy, it is impossible to remove every bit of fungus out of the patient's body. And if the fungus is not going to respond to amphotericin, if the patient's immunity is not going to build up, then none of what we are doing is going to make any sense. And obviously, if there is a known immunocompromise, we need to reverse that with aggressive sugar control. And with that, I think it's time for Prerna to show her cases, the different clinical scenarios that we had, so that we can have some case-specific discussions, because I think we are running a little short on time.
Sure, I'll just quickly hurry through some of the scenarios.
But till Dr. Prerna is setting her slide, Dr. Binyala sir, is there any role of prophylaxis treatment to avoid mucormycosis in patients who are admitted for a long term, or who have given steroid therapy aggressively, or who are on oxygen therapy for a long time?
Yeah, so prophylaxis therapy per se for mucormycosis, we don't have any as of now. Preventive measures, of course, we should follow. So any patient who falls in this high risk category, like a patient who's diabetic, immunocompromised, on steroids for any other therapy, organ transplant patients, so they should take utmost care of preventing mucormycosis. So first is a very good personal hygiene, and as Dr. Rahul Modi suggested, control of sugars have to be very, very strict. And if you are recovering from a COVID syndrome, you should always make sure that even after recovering for next 6 to 8 weeks, you must be wearing a mask to prevent other aerosol infections which can come into you very easily, because the lung parenchyma is significantly compromised. So that also prevents you from getting the infection like mucor, because mucor generally spreads through your inhalation of the spores which are there in the air. So protect your airway wearing a mask post-COVID for at least 6 to 8 weeks after recovering from COVID also. And correctable factors like sugars, your immunity, you should take care of. That is the way. Prevention is the only way. There is no prophylactic therapy for mucor as such as of now.
Thank you. Yes, Prerna.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll quickly run through a couple of cases. Now, this is a 60-odd-year-old lady who came to us, and she was already admitted actually for mucormycosis. But one of the presenting signs at the time of admission was a total ophthalmoplegia. She has a non-seeing right eye. It's PL negative with a complete ptosis and a frozen globe with a little bit of proptosis that is even visible because of the fullness in the upper eyelid. We did an MRI. This was at one of, she was definitely financially restricted. So we did an MRI and it showed sinus involvement, which was there from the anterior to the posterior ethmoids, the sphenoids, as well as the maxillary sinus was involved. There was definite amount of orbital involvement with muscle congestion or thickening compared to the other side, and the involvement of the retrobulbar space as well. At this point, the retrobulbar involvement was there, but maybe not so significant. At this point, a lot of surgeons would probably jump to debridement along with exentration. But I think this case is a borderline case where you can still decide to probably observe the orbit, maybe debride the sinuses first, and then take a call on orbital exentration. So I actually decided to wait on the patient, and they decided to seek a different opinion elsewhere, and she was exentrated along with debridement. So I've lost the patient to follow, but this is one of the cases that can be open to discussion. Second case is slightly more clear cut. As more and more time is progressing and we are understanding more about the disease, we are getting better outcomes for people who present early. So this again is a slightly senior lady who presented with a left eye fullness and a very mild ptosis. Now this is a very silent presentation of mucormycosis. She had no history of nasal stuffiness or discharge. This can be overlooked. So this has to be seen with a very high index of suspicion. You see upper eyelid fullness, some amount of edema of the eyelids and ptosis. She's post-COVID diabetic. So she had a CT scan with her from the previous physician she went to. She did not take admission there because it was an OPD setup. But we do see some non-specific changes. Like Rahul said, CT is not very specific for mucor, and you can't wait till you see invasive bone changes or broken bone, because that may not happen at all, or it may happen very late in the disease. She had signs of non-specific sinusitis. We did order a MRI, and that showed some changes. So I referred her to my ENT colleague. This patient, I don't have the MRI images. I'll be taking it from my colleague. But she underwent aggressive debridement and amphotericin B, and this is 1 week after discharge from the hospital. She's doing well with some amount of vision intact. So this is how you can still be conservative and have very good results. And here again, I reiterate that the ophthalmologist role is a supportive role. Though we call it ROCM, it need not necessarily have the orbital and the cerebral or the cranial involvement if it is controlled really well and aggressively in the initial stages. That is provided you have a high judgment to pick this up. Coming to a third case, this fellow has a very unfortunate story. So this is not at presentation. He was being dealt with a team of ENT and an ophthalmologist. I had not seen the patient yet, but this is 5 days after starting amphotericin B. This is the MRI scan at the same time, which shows sinus involvement. Now here you do see the scan is probably a little pixelated, but there was involvement of the muscles of mastication. If you see, look at the right eye, the outer quadrant going from the lateral orbit to the outside is the temporalis muscle. But there was no gross orbital involvement. Some amount of posterior or orbital, very slight involvement was present from the posterior ethmoids. So I was called in somewhere 10 days after this scan. And at this point, because the vision was still counting fingers at 1 meter, I decided to observe and not intervene. The patient underwent debridement, which was under local anesthesia. So I am assuming it was not an aggressive debridement, and post debridement, he kept deteriorating. And I was called in again after a couple of days to take a look at the patient. And 1 week after debridement, this is what I see. So the proptosis has increased, the chemosis has increased, eyelid edema has increased, the cheek swelling has increased. He already had a facial nerve palsy, and that stays same. If I look at the eye movements, there is restriction in all gazes. This is, mind you, it's still a seeing eye. He's still able to see at about ½ meter distance. And there is RAPD grade 3. At this stage, I decided to repeat the scans, and to my horror, I did see. So, this is what I was speaking about. There is some amount, this is a maxillary sinus. I don't know if I can have the pointer here.
It's seen well, seen well.
Yeah, so the maxillary sinus shows this little bit of mucosal edema which can happen post-operatively. The anterior ethmoids were cleared, but however, posterior ethmoids had some remnant disease. I probably don't have the depictive scan, and it had invaded into the orbit, as well as you see some lateral orbital shadow and attenuation here on MRI. So this disease had progressed, but considering it's a seeing eye, I still decided to wait on it. This patient is under observation. At this point, he also, what I noticed was he also had a little bit of cavernous sinus edema. I don't know if it was edema or thrombosis. It's very difficult to see on imaging. But these kind of patients have slightly poorer prognosis, because once the cavernous sinus is involved, the thrombi can even approach the internal carotid artery into the cavernous sinus, and you can have multiple thrombotic infarcts. Now, this is a very lucky patient. He's an old friend. So he's status post hematopoietic stem transplant on systemic immunosuppression, had COVID 2 weeks ago, was on Visalone, very acute observer. So he came to us with upper eyelid swelling and left-sided mild facial swelling. Now, this is again a very early sign. From an ophthalmologist point of view, what you can observe is the superior fat pads have started getting projected out because of increased orbital pressure. If you look at his tear trough on the right side, which should have been there on the left, is obliterated because of the swelling, and you also see cheek edema. So again, he was lucky because he only had sinus involvement. He had non-specific sinusitis on the other side as per the ENT surgeon. Aggressive debridement was done. His eye is intact, his vision is intact. The patient was shifted eventually from amphotericin to isobuconazole because of his the renal toxicity, and he's doing well. Now, looking at something with very gross orbital involvement, this is something that I will call very gross orbital involvement. This is a representative MRI of another patient. This MRI is very interesting because I actually saw a lot of pus pockets in the retrobulbar space, so I had archived it. And with this kind of clinical picture, maybe even with a slight vision, say hand movement close to face or just perception of light, I think my threshold for exenteration will be low. And this is the kind of patient that needs exenteration along with debridement. Because with this kind of infective load, there is no other way for the medicine to reach that necrotic space very easily. So he underwent an exenteration. Unfortunately, he had to be shifted to the ICU because of some complications post-surgery. So the morbidity of the surgeries as well is quite high that we need to consider. But now he is at least maintained and he's stable. So these are a couple of just cases I wanted to share describing where exactly I prefer exenterating and where I would still be conservative and maybe wait, be hopeful that the patient does not deteriorate and wait on medical therapy, or sometimes inject amphotericin B in the orbital compartment while the ENT takes up the patient for debridement.
Right. So how are you doing on time, Dr. Aarti? It's already almost 6.
Yeah, one question Dr. Rahul, everyone would, are eagerly waiting to listen to is about amphotericin,
Right.
So much happening, there's so much shortage, just like tocilizumab, which was there last year and, some few months back. So could you just throw some light on amphotericin, where and how, and, when, and main is how long do we use it? What is the end point? When do we decide that, now the patient is out of danger?
So the patient is never really out of danger. At least for the first week, 10 days, I mean, it's all up in the air. And what we need to realize is that patient may require multiple debridements. And there are multiple comorbidities with these conditions. They are very sick patients. For amphotericin B, I think, we have Binyala sir, he'll be the right person to talk about it. We have 2 varieties, just to quickly go over it. Then I'll give the then I'll request Dr. Binyala to take over. One is the liposomal, which is a drug of choice. And the second is the conventional amphotericin B, which is the amphotericin B deoxycholate. Again, along with this, there is a lipid emulsion which is there, and there is a lipid complex which is there. Currently, now the problem with conventional is that there is a definite nephrotoxicity involved. It is not if, but it is when it will happen. So most patients eventually will have a rising creat and will have to switch over. In patients who are affording and in ideal scenarios where the drug shortage is not a concern, we can start with liposomal. The cost of therapy varies by a factor of 100 between the two in terms of daily dosing, and so there is a big cost. I mean, conventional amphotericin is about 300, 350 rupees a day, along with every other thing. I'm just talking about the MRP of the drug. And liposomal, if I'm to give in the correct dose, which is 5 milligrams per kg, then I need 5 vials, which is easily 35, 40,000, if not more. So that's you know, it's a big difference when you're talking to the patient in terms of cost of care, because this therapy needs to go on for at least a few weeks, if not longer. And sir, your inputs about amphotericin B. What has been your experience? Sir, your sound is off, sir.
Hello, can you hear me now? Am I audible?
So till then,
So what my thing, yeah, any other questions, Aarti? I was just thinking I'll add a few points for amphotericin.
I have a question for you. Is basically any role of liquid paraffin in patients post-COVID?
So very clear. See, mucormycosis is not a new disease. We are dealing it for quite some time. So we know why it happens. So studies have shown close to 90% of healthy nasal cavities will harbor some amount of fungals, maybe aspergillus, maybe mucor species. So if you're working with soil, if you're not working with soil, if you're working in an office, if you're working in the cleanest environment, there is a 98% chance that your nose will grow fungus. So it is your immune response primarily that decides how the fungus is going to interplay with your body. So take precautions, wear a mask, don't involve in, you know, hygiene is important, but most important and the only factor which is in our control is sugar control, sugar control, sugar control for the first 2 months post discharge from the hospital. That is our biggest bet, because I mean the immunity is going to come up on its own. The neutropenia which is there because of the steroids, we cannot really reverse it that easily. We cannot reverse the immunocompromise caused by COVID that easily. We have to give it time, let the natural course of things happen. But what we can do, and all my patients which are post-mucor, all have got admitted. On admission sugars, none of them had sugars below 200, 250. Everybody was in a partial decay state. So that tells us, and you know, I'm sure Sir will also give his numbers from Sanjeevani. From what I heard, they are not very high. I can tell you, Hirandani and Holy Spirit, more than 8,000 patients with COVID, not a single in-house patient. All the patients that we are getting are referred from elsewhere. So we have a strong post-COVID care program which helps patients pick up, not early, just prevent the problem. So it's an entirely preventable problem, and please don't panic. You know, if you've had COVID, if you've not received steroids, if you've not received any, you know, immunomodulator, very low risk, especially if you're non-diabetic, to develop. Just isolated COVID, mild COVID causing mucor, I don't think is a real thing.
Role of betadine lavage? Or,
I mean, it is like, you know, role of betadine lavage. Betadine is our favorite thing to kill COVID, to kill mucor, to kill everything. But I mean, it's the immunity which is going to decide, right? I mean, the betadine helps, especially if you're immunocompromised, transplant recipient, you know, blood malignancies and all of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just stuck on blood sugar control, because I think that's the single most important thing. Sir, are you there? Dr. Binyala?
Sir, we can't hear you. Sir, we can't hear you, Dr. Rajesh.
So about amphotericin B, I'll just add a couple of points. See, availability is an issue. It is not that conventional amphotericin is less effective than liposomal. Conventional amphotericin is only a little more toxic than liposomal, and it's not that liposomal will never cause any renal toxicity. There are, I mean, it's a qualitative difference. In the ideal world, we would like to give everybody liposomal, but we have in the last 15 years, residency days, I mean, it's very difficult for patients to afford liposomal in the long run. And we have given conventional, works like a charm in patients. So efficacy-wise, there is no data that there is any difference. It's only the toxicity. So if you have a young patient with preserved kidney status, you can very well start with conventional to save his life if liposomal is not available or he is not affording it. And the other options are somewhere in between. The lipid emulsion is a little less nephrotoxic than the conventional variety, and the lipid complex also. But there is very little data in terms of efficacy. And so I would suggest if your patient is having nephrotoxicity, then go for liposomal. If not available, then either of the lipid complexes would do. But if the kidney status is fine, go ahead with the conventional. It will take a little longer, but the efficacy wise, there's not going to be a problem. The drug works almost as efficaciously as the liposomal variety.
Yeah, I probably will add one point here. So conventionally, if I ever have to do TRAM, I always pick up amphotericin B deoxycholate because the dose is so less that it does not make sense to waste a whole vial of liposomal amphotericin B. And mainly it's like a depot of drug that you leave behind in the orbit. So we are not even concerned about some additional systemic toxicity because of a 3 milligrams or something. So this is one place where probably you, given the resource restricted scenario, you probably choose directly amphotericin deoxycholate instead of liposomal.
Sure.
Dr. Binyala, sir?
Sir is back. If he can just highlight a couple of points on maybe isavuconazole and a role of when to introduce the second drug or posaconazole and what is a good time to stop therapy. Maybe all of us can learn a lot about it then.
Absolutely. So are you there? Yeah, I can hear you now.
I think we are hearing Dr. Nilima Seth's.
Okay. Dr. Binyala, sir, are you there?
Yeah, I am there. Hello. Hello.
Aarti, in the interest of time, because I'm sure, being a working day, people may be having their patients lined up for practice, and we are still happy. I think we still have a significant crowd waiting with us.
Right.
So just quickly, I'll just to complete the presentation. Amphotericin, typically our target dose for conventional amphotericin is cumulative is around 2.5 grams is what we like to touch. So if you're giving 50 milligrams every day of conventional, then it takes about 50 days to reach 2.5. That's a minimum that we would like to give. If you're giving liposomal, then we give up to 250 to 300 milligrams per day. And then we tend to target a little higher, but we tend to reach our target also faster because we are able to give more drug. So 3 to 5 grams typically, the more you're able to give safely, but these are toxic drugs. Once the creat starts rising, then we have to give drug holidays to let the numbers settle. Hypokalemia and rising creat. These are the two most, something that will happen for each and every patient. So we do twice a week creat monitoring, especially if it is stable. If it is rising, then even do daily. Along with that, potassium, sometimes you have to give potassium correction daily in the form of oral or injectable KCl, along with the fluid. Good hydration is very important for these patients. And also a lot of these patients will have some amount of drug-induced, anemia. So typically most patients, if they stay the course for about a month or so in the hospital, they'll end up receiving 1 or 2 transfusions along with it. If for whatever reason they are not able to tolerate the drug, then or the drug is not working, then posaconazole is a relatively old drug. I would say a little more data is available for that. It's given in the liquid form traditionally with a loading dose followed by an single dose. We have delayed release tablets now, which make his life easy. And the new kid on the block is isavuconazole, Cresemba. Again, there's a loading dose for that, followed by the single dose. Both of these are fairly expensive too. Isavuconazole is somewhere like 2 lakh rupees a month. And typically we like to give at least 3 to 6 months. And this is something that we'll have to counsel and talk about the cost of therapy with the patient almost on a daily basis, because everything adds up. Posaconazole is slightly cheaper, but still I would say it could cross a lakh to give it for a month. Adjuvant therapy, there is, like I said, minimum 3 to 6 weeks of amphotericin followed by 3 to 6 months of transition to posaconazole. When do we stop amphotericin? We stop amphotericin when we see non-progression on the MRI. When we have documented non-progression on the MRI, serial MRIs, typically if everything is going
Review.
then we do an MRI say at around 2 months or so. And then if we see non-progression, no new lesions coming up, because the old lesions will take time to clear out. So if there is non-progression on the MRI, then we can switch over to posaconazole, isoconazole. And if that non-progression is stable over the period of next 3 to 6 months, then we can consider cessation of therapy. We do repeated nasal endoscopies for these patients to look how the mucosa is healing. Typically over the dead tissues, if we are seeing new mucosa coming up, that's a very good sign that the patient is recovering. And hyperbaric oxygen therapy or some amount of iron chelator therapy is being proposed, but none of these are part of any guidelines. They are still experimental. So we have ordered that when to stop therapy, and I think prevention is our best bet. Control. Prerna, would you like to take over for this?
Yeah, I think you've already reiterated all the points that all the high risk factors need to be controlled and immunosuppression needs to be reversed. And again, we can only prevent it if we have a very high suspicion to pick up the disease in the early stage. More than all this, probably even a form of COVID prevention will prevent the associated sequelae in the form of ROCM. So it's important to probably one way we can prevent it is in the COVID hospitals, if we sensitize the treating physicians about the high risk patients needing a screening in the first 1 to 3 weeks, then maybe we can pick up cases that would otherwise stay silent and come in later. I don't know how feasible this is, but I think it can definitely be done.
So by screening, you mean to say an imaging?
I think at least screening for symptoms, looking for stuffy nose, and maybe a routine endoscopy, like Dr. Rahul said. I don't know what is the specificity. It's definitely specific if you see the blackish necrotic material. But I think Dr. Rahul will be able to highlight more whether it's a feasible option or no, if we can screen the extremely high-risk patients who've had all these features.
So Dr. Rahul, quickly, like how easy is it to do an nasal endoscopy? Like Dr. Prerna said that, that can be one of the lines of treatment. You are on mute, Dr. Rahul.
So I think it's pretty easy to do, but I'm not so sure how many cases we'll be able to pick up at the right time. Again, I mean, I feel I'm the strong believer of this diabetes control stuff, I mean, we are seeing patients because we are not seeing patients treated in good facilities. Mostly, we are not seeing patients who are, who are taking good care of their blood sugar. So that is something that I would stress, and it's possible to do it in the ICU setting. It can be done in the bedside with portable light sources and all. It's not impossible. I'm not so sure how much of a pickup, because we don't get mucor when the patient is in the hospital. We get mucor once the patient has left the hospital 30 days out, 40 days out, 20 days out. So that is when it is difficult. So if you are telling the patient to get a nasal endoscopy done, he might as well do a blood sugar testing at home, and that will be, because we are not seeing even in sick patients mucor developing during their stay in the hospital.
So nasal endoscopy is an IPD procedure.
No, it's an OPD procedure. It's an OPD. It's like a
so like can even be done as an OPD procedure.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that's Dr. Rajesh here. So Prerna, I wanted to ask one more question. Are there any slit lamp findings do we see in suspected mucor, anterior, posterior segment, anything?
See, you may just be able to see the arterial occlusion on a 90D, but it's as such not a slit lamp pickup disease. It's a disease that needs thorough evaluation of the adnexa and the motility and the proptosis, along with the other clinical signs which are related to sinusitis. So it's actually easier to screen them even in the ward. You don't need to necessarily bring them to a slit lamp to see these patients. Only very rarely patients who have seventh nerve palsy early in the disease, do have lag of thalamus, and the patient who deteriorated did have a neurotrophic ulcer for about 10 days or so, which was treated on topical drops. But we are looking at a much more serious condition and not just, exposure keratopathy. I do agree with Dr. Rahul that we don't see patients in the COVID hospitals. So I don't know how much sense or how feasible it is to sensitize. So most of these, the last patient that I showed was admitted in Seven Hills who had complained of headache, went back to the hospital, but was turned down saying this is only a COVID facility. So go to a headache OPD clinic. And that's how the delay to pick up mucor had happened. So I don't know what is the right way forward to sensitize the high risk population that after discharge, you need to be really careful and you need to come in for screening visit if any of these symptoms are present. That is something that needs to really be taken home seriously.
Yeah. Do we have Dr. Rajesh Binyala, sir?
Yeah, I'm there. Am I audible now?
Yes, absolutely. Before we
Extremely
lose you
sorry
again,
for this.
another take home
Probably
point.
I am the oldest among all of you, so
No,
not
no.
so technical savvy, I think.
So, sir, what is your end point? Like, what is your take home point for general practitioners or as an ophthalmologist, as a dental surgeon?
Yeah, so two things I would put it here. One is like how Dr. Rahul Modi had put up, and sinus endoscopy, which could be done on an OPD basis, would be a very, because mucor you can diagnose only from a tissue biopsy. There's no other way you can diagnose mucor. So if we have a lot of ENT people, doctors like Dr. Rahul who can do an endoscopy on OPD basis, we can pick up many more patients of mucor. With little suspicion, if your endoscopy, sinus endoscopy as a diagnostic tool can be done on OPD basis, it will really solve lot of unanswered questions. And second thing, of course, is we have to have our own hygiene. We have to take care of our own diabetes and our immunity, which can prevent mucor. We at Sanjeevani, we have a follow-up OPD for all our COVID patients. When we discharge them, we call them regularly for the first 4 weeks, every 10 days, to see how we can, pick up any kind of post-COVID complications, and the commonest now being mucor. And to add to this, one of the presentation is headache, like how Dr. Tehlani mentioned. The patient presents only with headache without any eye signs or any complaint of sinus complaints. So headache would be a definite premonitory sign which we should really look for. In fact, I had a patient who presented with headache. We did an MRI, it came normal. After a week, he came back again with the same headache with more severe intensity. So I referred him to one of my neurology friend. He asked for a repeat MRI because he could not pick up anything neurologically. And in the second MRI, it showed invasion in the sinuses, which later on with endoscopy proved to be mucor. So headache has been a very, very presenting complaint in these patients where they don't come up with eye signs, or probably they are not so intelligent to pick up the eye signs on their own, but just present with the headache which comes. So screening of patients post-COVID is very important, and we must call them at least for the next 3 months after COVID regularly in your OPD to see if we can pick up these diseases.
Absolutely. That's a very important take home point. A simple symptom like a headache, which usually we would miss. I just wanted to ask one more thing. This question may sound a little stupid, but I wanted to ask, like, we are seeing more of these cases in North India or, other states than Maharashtra. Any particular reason that, it's seen more widespread there in the North and the...
So as we know, mucor is a disease which is spread through the mold, which is seen more in decomposite matter in the soil. So then it is always more in the non-cosmopolitan areas where you have a more risk of exposure to these kind of material. The pollen which comes from the soil, from the decomposite matter. So that's the reason probably we see it more from outside the cities rather than the city. So northern areas they are being more pollen because of the farm areas and things like that. People working in the soils. So they are the people who get exposed to the mucor more easily than people in the cities. So probably that could be the reason.
One more thing, like mucor even has interstitial involvement, right? So any screening to be done, like when we are doing MRI of the brain and the orbit, anything we need to do for checking that?
For mucor, there is not anything else which we can do as of now. It is only the MRI brain which can give an initial thought process to think about mucor, and then it is just the tissue biopsy. Till now they are trying to get a PCR test for mucor, but which is still in the investigational phase. We don't have any PCR test. So I think Rahul has a big role in pick up mucor early. MRI can just give a clue that look for it. So I think screening is the only solution.
So, Dr. Rahul, how would you like to end? Like any take-home points from your side as an ENT surgeon, as a surgeon who's seeing so much mucormycosis, treating them day in day out?
So I mean, it's just a word. I mean, I may sound like a broken record. Is first 2 months everything is mucor. If it is coming with any suspicious symptoms, keep your antennas on the high alert for the patients who are first 2 months post-COVID, especially the ones who have received steroids. If the patient is saying post-COVID, just RT-PCR positive, home care, perhaps not, but anybody who's got admitted for oxygen therapy would have received steroids. So keep your antennas on the high alert. I would say rely more. I mean, typically we would rely more on clinical judgment, but here I would be have a little low threshold to take more references and do a little more imaging than I would normally do. So, and keep these patients under close follow-up. If you're in doubt, call them 2 days later, 1 day later, and keep them close to your chest. If you feel, you are in doubt, let me just wait for a day, let me just wait for 2 days. Keep these patients close to your chest and just do a good follow-up. And then you can perhaps not land up in a complicated scenario. But it's a tricky situation. I mean, I just hope that, the numbers go down sooner than later. It's a very tricky situation to be.
Dr. Prerna, any take-home points as an ophthalmologist? Post-exenteration, how do we go about anything like the other eye? Is there any role of sympathetic ophthalmitis? Anything you would want to highlight for general ophthalmologists?
The exenteration or removal of the eye also has a very big psychosocial impact on people. We do encounter patients in whom maybe we see no other way, but they really don't want to get done with the surgery to remove the eye because people, don't see the impact of removal of sinuses as much as removal of the eye. There's definitely no role of sympathetic ophthalmia because you're not dealing with the uveal tissues. You're removing all the orbital contents in toto. Aftercare would definitely be in the form of thorough routine checkups of the other eye because that becomes the only seeing eye. And there are a couple of prosthetic specialists who do orbital exenteration processes. So if anyone has a doubt, I have about 3 people at the tip of my tongue who, I can guide them to. And we just need to look at the healing of the socket per se. Sometimes what also happens in these patients, though it's spoken about sometimes more, I see it very rarely, is there can be formation of fistulas because the orbit is also opened up from the sinus side and the movement of the flap, the skin eyelid flap is a little bit. But we need to just take good wound care as in any wound. In the end, you have to have a healthy contracted concave orbital socket over which the patient can wear a spectacle mounted or a glue fitted exenteration prosthesis. Not to forget the other eye. So protective glasses have to be given and thorough annual fundus screening for the other eye after the mucor has settled and the patient has gone back home is important.
Can there be a bilateral involvement?
There is bilateral involvement. I am yet to see it in these last 1.5 years, thankfully, but it has been reported in literature, even in the countries like the United States of America, where they have written that there was bilateral involvement and the patients couldn't be revived.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rajesh Vinyala, sir, any take-home point before we end the session?
I think the take-home point is just to keep your diabetes under good control. And we should try to take all preventive measures from getting COVID, because I think that is the beginning of mucor. So if we can prevent getting COVID, I think we can prevent a lot more complications.
We have a few questions in the chat box which actually direct to the same answer. When, do we warn these patients who are recovering from COVID about dusting or cleaning their home or anything like? What would you?
We have to wear, as we said, we have to wear a mask at least for next 4 to 8 weeks after recovering from COVID also, because you are immunocompromised post-COVID infection. So forget mucor, you can get many more other infections also. So prevention by wearing a mask will prevent mucor also. So even dusting, because this is the place where, of course, not this dust in the house which can contain mold, but it is the one which is there in the dust in the decomposing matter. So you should wear a mask when you're doing any household chores like dusting or cleaning, which can prevent mucor if you're already recovering from a COVID situation.
Thank you. So Dr. Rahul, sir, do you want to say something before we end?
No, I think it's been a wonderful session. Aarti, thanks so much for the initiative. Wonderful to discuss with everything. Great panelist. And we had senior members, Shyam sir, Rajesh sir, attending the whole session. We are very grateful for that. And that's about it. And we can have, if there is anything specific questions, I'm sure people are waiting to start their clinic also.
Right. Prerna has answered quite a lot in the chat box, and we've been trying to cover most of the questions. If there are anything, I'll definitely direct to you all in future. And thank you so much. I would just like to mention to all the participants here that all the three doctors, they have removed time from their busy clinical practice. They are actually, I can see all three of them are in the OPDs. Thank you so much. I just had to call them once and ask them to do this, and they were so welcoming with the entire idea and so enthusiastic to put the entire program into place. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajesh Binyala sir, Dr. Rahul Modi, and Dr. Prerna Tehliani. It is always a pleasure working with you. Thank you all the 100 participants who have been there right from 5 o'clock till now 6:20. That it's been amazing. And my thank you speech would be incomplete without thanking Ajanta Pharma. They have really worked very hard behind the curtains, organizing the entire webinar, inviting all the doctors, coordinating, and setting up such a beautiful platform, which we did not have any glitches in the entire 1.5 hour of session. Would just like to mention a special thanks to Mr. Shailendra, GM Ajanta Pharma, Mr. Sunil, DGM, and Mr. Sachin, and special thanks to Sana for doing the IT work so well, and Vaibhav and Sudeep. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming today, and hoping to see you all in future for other more webinars. Thank you so much.